So we'll pursue now with Katerina Papamichail. She's a Greek architect and expert in universal design and accessibility of the built environment and accessible tourism. Former head of architectural studies, Greek Social Housing Organization, and section manager for Olympic Paralympic Village in the Athens Olympic Games in 2004. She's an expert for the European Standardization Committee on accessibility requirements for public procurement in the built environment. Co-author of the Greek Accessibility Guidelines and founding member of ENAT, the European Network for Accessible Tourism. So I'm happy to present you, Katerina, with the presentation.
Thank you very much. Can I have the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
So, do I press the green?
It's the green, yes.
Okay. Good morning. I would like to speak about some initiatives that the European Union has taken to enforce accessibility in the built environment, and especially about a study that was carried out for harmonizing and having a European standard for public procurement. Europe has made a strategic commitment to protecting and safeguarding human rights and fundamental freedoms of people with disabilities, upholding the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Europe is committed to using the Design for All approach to eliminate barriers in the built environment and to apply technical harmonization and standardization to ensure the free movement of people, goods and services with the internal market. It is important to underline that approximately 16% of the EU gross-domestic product is publicly procured. Therefore, strengthening accessibility requirements in public procurement of the built environment is an important means for achieving Europe's social and human rights goals. Accessibility in the built environment is an essential and fundamental right for all members of society. Providing accessible facilities and spaces empowers people to enjoy everyday activities and enables them to participate safely, independently, with confidence and with dignity. And this applies to all people, including the people with disabilities. Regarding physical accessibility, we all know there is a problem. There are many rules and regulations in the EU member states, but actual accessibility of the built environment is not yet satisfactory. People have been to the moon, and not only once, but some people still cannot go to the square or to a public building in their own city. Lack of accessibility denies many European citizens their rights to free movement and access to buildings and services, and it is also very expensive to fix, wasting public money. So why we have all this problem? There is lack of access requirements in public procurement, which means that projects are funded with public money, they not require accessibility. There is lack of conformity. Projects again funded with public money are not checked for accessibility in a consistent or adequate way. The Public Procurement Directive, Article 26, states that contracting authorities may lay down special conditions relating to the performance of a contract, provided that these are compatible with community law and are indicated in the contract notice or in the specifications. Conditions governing the performance of a contract may, in particular, concern social and environmental considerations. According to my opinion, very weak formulation, no legal power. So realizing this problem, the European Commission has taken some initiatives to improve accessibility on the built environment. First initiative, European Standards Committee study ordered by the European Commission under mandate M420 to examine existing standards and public procurement practices for the built environment and to provide recommendations for possible future standardization and conformity assessment. The study had to be carried out in 2 phases. Phase 1 has already completed between the years 2009-2011. Phase 2 will be carried out to make the EU standard and an online toolkit which will assist public procurers to ensure these requirements are met. And the second initiative is the preparation of a proposal for a European Accessibility Act within the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, addressing equal access to goods and services for all citizens. As a member of the expert group, I will try to give you shortly the picture of this study. The objectives: to make an inventory of existing standards, guidelines and regulations from EU member states and regions and other countries, describing the functional requirements and technical specifications in order to identify weak points or gaps, and if there is a need, to create a European standard on accessibility of the built environment, which will include functional requirements and minimum technical specifications. So then to provide information on conformity assessment as well as the potential suitability of existing access standards as criteria for awarding public contracts. And finally, to produce an online toolkit which will assist public procurers to ensure these requirements are met. The expert team made an inventory of over 300 accessibility standards and guidelines in 24 European member states countries, 2 EFTA countries, and 4 international countries, Canada, South Africa, USA, and Australia. It is interesting to give some numbers, just an indication, to see how differently European countries define or implement accessibility. Only 4 countries use accessibility standards which are referred in building regulations. 2 countries also make reference to accessibility standards, but these vary in different regions. 2 countries have considerable differences among their regional building regulations, and 3 countries have regional differences in their accessibility requirements. As you see in the map, 15 countries have building regulations which refer to guidance documents. 13 countries include accessibility requirements within the building regulations, and they make no reference to any standards or guidance documents. So, continuing, what are the general findings? There is a plethora of regulations, standards, and guidance currently available to assist in the design and delivery of an accessible built environment. Gaps do exist, but there are very few accessibility requirements and buildings elements that are not appropriately covered by a regulation, standard, or guidance documents somewhere in the EU or internationally. So we have enough guidance, but still no satisfactory results. The level and scope of guidance available on issues related to the needs of people with mobility impairments far exceeds that available for other disabled groups. As we see in this graph, in the last columns, we see coverage for cognitive and knowledges is very poor. The other findings of the study: the enforcement of regulation and standards varies, as we saw, among EU member states. In general, conformity assessment in EU member states is weak, with poor consideration for accessibility matters. The system of enforcement of legislation, regulation, and guidance could be improved considerably in many countries to ensure better building control practices. Accessibility is included as a criterion in public procurement in 19 countries, according to the reports of national experts. But the study of published tenders showed that almost no contract notices referred to accessibility. Why are accessible requirements not being implemented? There is poor understanding by designers of the needs of people when using buildings. There is inadequate education and knowledge of those designing, constructing, or managing and checking the built environment, which is the procurement and conformity assessment. There is lack of understanding of accessibility issues among the people who are creating various standards, not including accessibility. And there is lack of user involvement in the design process. The system of the EU public procurement does not pay enough attention to accessibility in the design process and in general requirements. And when there is a national legislation to set requirements, the procurers for follow-up are almost always weak and ineffective. The EU should enforce the policies coming to the recommendations of the study. The EU should enforce the policies of inclusivity and design for all in any procurement process for publicly funded projects. This is one of the most critical issues. You can never get something if you don't require to have it. A common EU standard for accessibility in the built environment is needed, with basic functional requirements and minimum technical specifications that will apply to both new buildings and renovations of existing ones. This will provide a common language for definition, description, and delivery of the accessible built environment. The ISO 21542 standard, Building Construction, Accessibility and Usability of the Built Environment, is proposed as the baseline document. This document has been accepted by a majority of countries internationally. And the ISO standard, which applies to indoor environment, needs to be supported and improved by other selected EU and international guidance documents. The proposed EU standard and conformity assessment procedures would not replace existing systems of legislation, guidance and control in the EU member states, but would serve as a basic minimum requirements and specifications, a common language to define and require accessibility for public procurement. Guidance should be produced in the form of an online toolkit for public procurers, showing how to clearly identify the legal requirements for equality and inclusion in accessible built environment and who is responsible for delivering and checking the projects, and this will be carried out in phase 2 of the mandate. Can I have one more minute, please? Yes. Thank you. Further recommendations: access standards should be enforced by EU legislation or as a technical requirement where public funding is granted for built environment works, and also to consider to create an EU accreditation system for professionals involved in the delivery of accessible built environments, and an EU model for tendering and conformity assessment, including the adoption of an access statement and competent person scheme designed to address accessibility throughout public procurement process. The EU Commission has been preparing a proposal for an Accessibility Act since 2011, realizing that the legal framework is not strong enough to promote accessibility. This European Accessibility Act would complement the legal framework with measures to support the creation of a market for accessible goods and services, but has not been yet presented to the EU member states for decision. So it is obvious that Europe is moving ahead, but still has a long way to go and has to be more determined and faster. Thank you very much.
Hi, My name is Brittany Perez, and I work at the Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access in Buffalo, New York, at the University at Buffalo under Dr. Ed Steinfeld. We do a lot of universal design and accessibility research, and your talks were fascinating. Thank you so much. We are in the process of working on universal design standards and just had a state of the science on universal design in the United States. And what we found so far, well, we found that the need for universal design guidelines and standards is necessary because the Americans with Disabilities Act is a minimum set of requirements and law, and based on our anthropometric research that we've done in our center, many of those minimum requirements are no longer adequate for the population, and makes the environment not usable for the majority of people. So we know that there's a need for universal design, and we hear the same exact sentiment that often law or requirements is not the way to go, that a set of guidelines is better. What we're battling with is getting people to buy in, and I don't mean financially, these would be provided free, but how have you addressed getting people to buy into using guidelines that are not requirements, that are not laws? Can you speak a little bit on your experience with that?
Who feels comfortable to give an answer?
I can put my headphones on.
OK, je peux essayer de répondre. Je vais répondre en français, par exemple. Ouais. Je vais attendre qu'elle mette sa traduction. Je dirais que c'est très difficile. C'est très difficile d'amener les gens à faire plus que les exigences de base. Ça prend des leaders qui sont sensibilisés, puis qui ont une volonté, puis qui comprennent que ça va servir à tous leurs citoyens. Et ça, c'est pas dans toutes les communautés qu'on a ces leaders-là. Et donc, c'est ça qui est la clé. Puis ensuite, la difficulté, c'est que ce qu'on a comme idée, ben ça puisse se concrétiser par des résultats, parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'étapes dans un projet. Puis souvent, ben au cours de ces étapes-là, il y a des choix. Puis les choix d'accessibilité ou de universal design qu'on a fait au départ, ben on les met de côté à cause des autres contraintes. Donc, assez rarement, on a des réalisations qui correspondent vraiment à ce qu'on voulait avoir, puis ce que nos leaders inspirés voulaient avoir. Donc, c'est extrêmement difficile. Avoir des guidelines, avoir des standards qui vont permettre à ceux qui peuvent aller plus loin ou qui sont prêts à s'engager à aller plus loin, c'est une bonne chose, mais augmenter le minimum, parce que qu'on essaie de sensibiliser, il va toujours avoir beaucoup de concepteurs puis de promoteurs qui vont vouloir faire le minimum. Donc, il faut augmenter aussi en parallèle ce minimum-là. Et nous, c'est ce qu'on a constaté dans l'étude qu'on a faite, c'est qu'à une certaine période, le Québec était quand même relativement bien placé par rapport au minimum, mais depuis une vingtaine d'années, les autres pays ont évolué beaucoup plus rapidement que nous. On est resté à notre minimum ici. Donc, c'est un gros défi, là. Et je pense que les consommateurs doivent le demander également. C'est ça qui va mettre de la pression pour qu'il y ait un intérêt.
Katerina will answer your question too. So.
Thank you. I agree it's a very complicated procedure, but I think we need two things. First of all, as we said about inspired leaders, I truly believe the high-level decision makers should be the ones to be educated, because this is, to be honest, this is my dream in the European Commission, Union, to see the leaders, the decision makers, to be forced to have a course to understand the issues and to understand that when we say accessibility is about sustainable development, is not only enabling disabled people and say words hidden or wrapped up in a nice paper. We have to really understand what it means. And this is why I believe in legislation, and especially in projects that are funded with public money. Because when there is a procedure of requiring minimum and accessibility, and checking the accessibility is the only way to be sure you're going to have accessibility. We're going to make a more accessible and sustainable environment. And then the private sector will follow, because the leaders, the decision makers, and the public sector is leading the way. So it's both. I think it's very important to educate the decision makers and to have law that enforces accessibility.
Thank you, Katerina.
Could I say something?
Other
Sorry?
question?
Could I say something on the?
Oh, sorry.
the answer?
Sorry.
Just a little. I just want to say that I think it's a very good point, very good question, and I hope I've tried to show that when you're talking about design of services, and how that affects people's experience in the tourism sector, I think maybe it's easier, for a tourism enterprise, a business owner, to understand that the way they design their services is going to have a very direct effect on their customer. There seems to be a gap between the services over here and the building over there. And when somebody's doing something to the building, they think, oh, we have to follow the rules, we have to follow the law. But when it's to do with the services, I think they can see a more immediate feedback. There's a shorter feedback loop there in the kind of return on investment that you can do. So if you've got a nice, like the Irish have done, I think that's a good example of what you can do, because you can go straight to the owner and say, try this toolkit. So they're not giving people the standard and say, here's the standard and go away and do what it says. But you give people tools so that they know what to do and how to do and why to do it, because it's very important that the toolkit really explains why you're doing something, to make your visual statements more easy to understand, you use a certain font size because of this. So when it's explained in a toolkit as a training or learning exercise, I think that gets the message across much easier, and people are less resistant to that kind of message than they are to being told what to do.
Bonjour à tous, donc merci pour vos présentations. Donc Jean-Philippe Chouika, moi j'ai fondé une société Cap Access en France qui accompagne donc les établissements publics et privés dans la mise en accessibilité. Alors c'était juste alors ça complète un petit peu ce que vous avez dit. Merci pour votre étude, j'ai très hâte de la lire sur le site de Keroul parce que ça va être extraordinaire. Et puis donc on a une loi, je crois qu'il faut qu'on en parle de cette loi française, elle a été abordée dans votre étude. Elle est très ambitieuse, cette loi française. C'est les dirigeants qui décident que tout le monde doit être accessible. Tout le monde. Établissement neuf et établissement existant. Avec un cadre normatif, avec des lois. Elle est très belle cette loi, elle est très ambitieuse, mais c'est une usine à gaz. Il y a des ordonnances, il y a des arrêtés, il y a des dérogations, il y a des atténuations. Alors, qu'est-ce que ça va donner dans 3 à 9 ans ? J'espère qu'on sera peut-être le pays européen le plus accessible. On a un très mauvais caractère, les Français, donc du coup on a une très belle loi. Voilà. Donc elle est contraignante. Juste pour ajouter, Katerina, si vous m'en voulez pas, je crois que mon anglais peut-être m'a joué des tours, mais je crois que vous avez une slide où vous dites que il y a 4 pays où dans la construction des bâtiments, on doit avoir, il y a des exigences. Et je vois, la France n'apparaît pas dans ces 4 pays, alors qu'il y a depuis 2007 des obligations dans les bâtiments neufs pour que les bâtiments soient existants et également pour les bâtiments neufs pour qu'ils soient accessibles et pour que les bâtiments existants soient accessibles aussi. Donc c'est une obligation légale en France. C'est très contraignant, c'est très dur. Mais c'était juste pour noter ce petit point aussi.
Okay, I don't. Maybe is it a new law or was existing before?
Oh, the law is for, date before 2005, and then there's
so maybe,
exigence from 2007.
I'm sorry,
January
I don't know.
1st.
Maybe I have to look. Maybe it was missed out in the study or in the results.
Okay.
Okay.
Donc, en fait, c'était juste pour compléter, plus qu'une question, voilà, sur cette loi française qui est extraordinaire. Et juste une chose, donc pour compléter, il y a une loi, il y a du bâti, il y a des bâtiments, Mais je crois que la suite, aussi, il y a une deuxième chose dont j'entends pas trop parler, c'est le label Tourisme et Handicap, qui est représenté par sa présidente Annette Masson, qui est présente sur le salon. Et ça va être la suite, puisque le label, en fait, va apporter plus d'accessibilité au niveau des services, du comportement. Et donc, je crois que les lois sont importantes pour la base, le bâti, mais qu'après, la volonté, les labels iront plus loin sur les services et sur le comportement. Ce sera l'avenir. Voilà.